Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Keith Cooper had built his empire from nothing. At 45, he owned 3 construction companies across Texas, employed over 200 men, and commanded respect in every room he entered. His hands bore the scars of manual labor from his younger days, but his mind had evolved into something sharper, calculating, methodical, unforgiving. The Cooper family lived in a sprawling ranch house outside Austin, complete with stables, a private lake, and enough land to disappear for hours without seeing another soul. Keith had given his wife, Marcella, everything she'd ever wanted: designer clothes, luxury cars, and the social status that came with being married to a successful businessman. Their son, Evan, now 22, had graduated from UT with a business degree, groomed to eventually take over the family enterprises. But Keith didn't know that behind his back, his perfect family was rotting from the inside. Marcella Cooper had grown tired of her husband's intensity, his unwavering focus on business, and what she called his primitive need to control everything around him. At 38, she still turned heads with her auburn hair and emerald eyes, and she'd begun to crave the attention of younger men who saw her as exciting rather than just another wealthy businessman's wife. Roman Cook had entered their lives 6 months ago as Evan's college friend and business partner in a startup venture Keith had agreed to fund. 24 years old, charming, and hungry for success, Roman possessed the kind of smooth confidence that made people trust him instantly. He'd studied Keith's patterns, learned his weaknesses, and identified the cracks in the Cooper family foundation. What Keith didn't realize was that Roman's interest in the Cooper family extended far beyond business. He'd been systematically seducing Marcella while poisoning Evan's mind against his father, convincing the young man that Keith's old-school methods were holding back their generation's potential. The first signs appeared during family dinners. Evan would challenge Keith's decisions with arguments that sounded too sophisticated, too practiced. Marcella would stay out later, claiming book club meetings and charity events that Keith's contacts never seemed to attend. But Keith Cooper hadn't survived 20 years in construction by ignoring warning signs. He hired a private investigator. The photographs arrived on a Tuesday morning. Marcella and Roman in a hotel room downtown, their bodies intertwined in positions that made Keith's jaw clench. But worse were the recordings of their conversations, where they discussed Keith as if he were a fossil to be discarded, planning how to manipulate him into signing over more assets to Evan's business ventures. Roman's voice came through clearly. "Once we bleed him dry, we can disappear. Start fresh somewhere he'll never find us." Marcella's laugh was musical, cruel. "Evan's already working on the legal documents. His father trusts him completely. The stupid bastard won't know what hit him until it's too late." Keith played the recordings 3 times, each repetition crystallizing his resolve. He built everything from scratch once before. If they wanted to destroy him, they'd discover that Keith Cooper was far more dangerous as an enemy than he'd ever been as a husband or father. That night, Keith sat in his study, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk, planning his response with the same methodical precision he'd used to build his business empire. He wouldn't just defend himself. He would ensure that everyone who betrayed him paid a price they'd never forget. The war was about to begin. Chapter 2, The Discovery. Keith's investigation into his family's betrayal revealed a web of deception that ran deeper than adultery. Over the next 2 weeks, he uncovered the full scope of their conspiracy while maintaining the facade of an oblivious husband and father. Roman Cook wasn't just sleeping with Marcella. He was using her to gain access to Keith's business network, copying client lists, stealing contract templates, and slowly siphoning information that would allow him to compete directly with Cooper Construction. The startup venture that Keith had funded was actually a front company designed to gradually absorb Keith's key employees and contracts. Evan's role proved even more devastating. Keith's own son had been forging signatures on bank documents, slowly transferring funds from the family trust into accounts that Roman controlled. The legal paperwork Marcella had mentioned wasn't just about business assets. They were planning to have Keith declared mentally incompetent, claiming his intense work habits and occasional fits of temper were signs of psychological instability. But Keith's most painful discovery came when he accessed Evan's personal computer. His son had been documenting Keith's daily routines, photographing his private safe combinations, and recording conversations during family dinners. The betrayal wasn't impulsive or passionate. It was calculated, thorough, and had been in progress for over a year. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a family dinner celebrating Evan's latest business success. Keith arrived home early from a job site to find Roman at their dining table, acting as if he belonged there, while Marcella fawned over him and Evan discussed their plans with barely concealed excitement. "Dad, you look tired," Evan said, his voice carrying false concern. "Maybe you should consider stepping back from the day-to-day operations. Let the younger generation handle things." Roman nodded sympathetically. "Keith, you've accomplished so much. You deserve to enjoy retirement while you're still healthy enough to appreciate it." Marcella reached across the table to touch Keith's hand, her wedding ring catching the light. "We all think it would be best for everyone. You've been under so much stress lately." Keith looked at their faces, his wife, his son, and the man who was destroying his family, and saw nothing but greed masked as concern. They actually believed they could manipulate him into surrendering everything he'd built. "You're right," Keith said quietly, setting down his fork. "I have been under a lot of stress. Maybe I should do something about that." After dinner, Keith retreated to his study and made a series of phone calls. The first was to Bernard Houston, his most trusted foreman and a man who'd worked construction sites with Keith for 15 years. Bernard owed Keith his life, literally, after Keith had pulled him from a collapsing foundation and paid for his medical expenses when the man had no insurance. The second call went to Santiago Berger, a private security contractor Keith had met during a military housing project. Santiago ran a discreet firm that specialized in problem resolution for wealthy clients who needed situations handled quietly. The third call was to Keith's lawyer, Samuel Collier, who'd helped Keith navigate contract disputes and business acquisitions for over a decade. Samuel was old-school legal counsel, the kind who understood that some battles couldn't be won in courtrooms. By midnight, Keith had assembled his response team. Tomorrow, he would begin the systematic destruction of everyone who had betrayed him. But first, he needed to test their resolve to see how far they were willing to go. He sent Evan a text message. "Need to discuss some urgent business matters. Meet me at the downtown office tomorrow at 6 p.m. Come alone." Then Keith opened his laptop and began transferring funds from accounts that Evan didn't know about, moving money to secure locations that would be impossible to trace or access. If his family wanted to play financial warfare, they'd discover that Keith had been preparing for this possibility long before they'd made their first move. The next evening would mark the beginning of their education in consequences. Chapter 3. The First Strike. The downtown office of Cooper Construction occupied the entire third floor of a steel and glass building that Keith had purchased 5 years earlier. After hours, the space felt like a cathedral of ambition. Mahogany conference tables, walls lined with framed project photos, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Austin skyline. Evan arrived precisely at 6, wearing a suit that Keith had paid for, carrying a leather briefcase that Keith had given him for graduation. The young man's confidence was palpable as he strode into his father's corner office, clearly believing this meeting would advance their takeover plans. "Dad, you wanted to discuss business?" Evan settled into the chair across from Keith's desk, his posture relaxed and expectant. Keith opened a manila folder and spread its contents across the desk. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, copies of forged documents, photographs of Roman and Marcella together, and transcripts of conversations that proved Evan's complicity in the conspiracy. "I want to discuss your business, yes." Keith's voice remained calm, but Evan's confident expression began to crack as he recognized the evidence. "Specifically, I want to understand how my son became a thief and a traitor." Evan's face flushed, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "Dad, I can explain." "No explanation needed." Keith stood and walked to the window, his back to his son. "You've documented your crimes quite thoroughly. The question now is what we do about it. You don't understand the pressure I've been under." Evan's voice took on a pleading tone. Mom said you'd never listen, that you'd just explode and make everything worse. We thought if we could just take control gradually. Keith turned around, his eyes cold as winter steel. You thought you could steal from me gradually. You thought you could manipulate me into signing away everything I built. You thought I was stupid enough to trust my own family. The office door opened and Bernard Houston entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Santiago Berger, a compact man whose eyes held the flat, assessing gaze of someone accustomed to violence. Dad, what's going on? Evan stood up, his confidence finally cracking in a genuine fear. You wanted to discuss business, Keith said. So let's discuss the consequences of stealing from the wrong person. Bernard closed the office door and engaged the lock. Santiago moved to the windows and closed the blinds. Suddenly, the spacious office felt much smaller. The transfers you made, Keith continued. I've already reversed them. The accounts Roman thought he controlled? They never actually existed. They were honey traps I set up 6 months ago when I first suspected something was wrong. Every dollar you thought you were stealing was actually my money flowing into accounts I control. Evan's face went white. That's impossible. Roman showed me the confirmations. Roman showed you what I wanted him to see. Keith opened his laptop and turned the screen toward his son. Your friend has been working with fabricated documents for weeks. Every piece of information he thought he was stealing from my business? Completely false. Every contract he thought he was copying? Fake companies with fake contact information. The laptop displayed a series of folders labeled with Roman's name, each containing detailed documentation of their surveillance operation and the false information they'd fed him. While you and your mother were planning my downfall, Keith continued, I was planning yours. The difference is that I'm actually good at it. Evan looked toward the door, but Bernard's presence made any escape attempt pointless. Dad, please, we can work this out. I'll call off everything with Roman. I'll return the money. The money was never gone, and Roman's plans are about to become irrelevant. Keith moved to his desk safe and withdrew a thick envelope. Inside here are copies of every crime you've committed, along with evidence of Roman's identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy charges. Enough to put both of you away for 10 to 15 years. You can't do this, Evan's voice cracked. I'm your son. Keith looked at the young man he'd raised, taught, and trusted, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. You stopped being my son the moment you decided to steal from me. Now you're just another criminal who made the mistake of targeting the wrong victim. Santiago stepped forward and handed Evan a single sheet of paper. Confession letter, the security contractor explained in a flat voice. Details your crimes and Romans. Sign it, and your father might consider allowing you to leave the country instead of going to prison. And if I don't sign? Keith smiled, and for the first time in his life, Evan saw his father as something genuinely terrifying. Then we test how much pressure your kneecaps can handle before they shatter. Bernard here used to work demolition before construction. He knows exactly how much force different joints can withstand. Evan looked at the 3 men surrounding him and realized that his father wasn't bluffing. This wasn't the businessman who'd raised him. This was the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived in industries where weakness meant destruction. With shaking hands, Evan signed the confession. Excellent, Keith said, taking the document and placing it in his safe. Now we're going to discuss what happens next. Chapter 4, The Trap Springs. The plan Keith had orchestrated over the following 3 weeks was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. While Evan remained under house arrest, effectively imprisoned in his own apartment under Bernard's watchful eye, Keith allowed Roman and Marcella to believe their scheme was proceeding perfectly. Roman had spent those weeks frantically trying to contact his secret accounts, unaware that every transaction he attempted was being monitored and recorded. The fake business documents Keith had prepared led Roman deeper into fabricated deals with non-existent clients, while Keith's real business continued operating through channels that Roman had never discovered. Marcella, meanwhile, had grown bolder in her affair, believing that Keith's recent distraction meant he was unaware of her activities. She'd been staying out later, spending more money, and making increasingly careless phone calls that Keith's surveillance team recorded with crystal clarity. The convergence came on a Friday evening when Marcella announced she was attending a charity gala downtown, an event that Keith knew she'd never RSVP'd for because he controlled the guest list. Instead, she was meeting Roman at an upscale hotel where they planned to celebrate what they believed was the final phase of their takeover. Keith arrived at the hotel first, having reserved the suite directly above theirs. Santiago's team had installed surveillance equipment throughout Roman's room during the afternoon, while Keith positioned himself to capture everything they said and did. What he recorded exceeded even his darkest expectations. Roman and Marcella weren't just planning to steal Keith's money. They intended to stage his death. Roman had connections with medical professionals who could make a heart attack appear natural, especially for a man Keith's age who worked in high-stress construction environments. They discussed the timing, the method, and how they would console grieving son Evan while quietly liquidating Keith's assets. The insurance alone will be worth millions. Marcella's voice came through clearly on the recording. And once he's gone, nobody will question Evan's authority to make business decisions. Roman's laugh was cold and confident. Your husband thinks he's so smart, but he's just another old man who doesn't understand how the modern world works. Tomorrow night, Keith Cooper becomes a tragic statistic. Keith listened to their plans with growing anticipation. They weren't just thieves anymore. They were would-be murderers. The legal and moral restrictions that might have limited his response had just evaporated completely. The next evening, Keith hosted what he announced as an impromptu family barbecue at the ranch. He told Marcella he wanted to celebrate Evan's business success and discuss some important family decisions. Roman was invited as Evan's business partner and close family friend. Marcella arrived nervous but excited, believing this was Keith's surrender disguised as a celebration. Roman came confident and charming, playing his role perfectly. Evan attended under duress, knowing that Bernard was watching his every move. Keith grilled steaks on the back patio while his guests enjoyed drinks and made small talk. The evening felt almost normal. A successful businessman entertaining his family and their friends beside the lake he'd paid to stock with bass and catfish. "Roman," Keith called out as he flipped the meat. "Could you help me carry these plates inside? I want to show you something in my study." Roman followed Keith into the house, chatting easily about business prospects and family dynamics. Keith's study felt warm and inviting, with leather-bound books and hunting trophies creating the atmosphere of old-world success. "Impressive collection," Roman said, examining the mounted deer heads and framed photographs of Keith's construction projects. "I've always believed in displaying my conquests," Keith replied, closing the study door behind them. "Speaking of which, I have something to show you." Keith activated his laptop and turned the screen toward Roman. The hotel room surveillance footage began playing, showing Roman and Marcella in intimate detail, followed by their recorded conversation about murdering Keith. Roman's confident expression dissolved into something approaching panic. "Keith, I can explain." "No need for explanations." Keith opened a desk drawer and withdrew a pistol, which he placed on the desk between them. "The question is whether you'd prefer to handle this like men, or if I should call the police and let them sort out your murder conspiracy." Roman stared at the weapon, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. "You can't be serious. This is insane. What's insane is thinking you could murder me and steal everything I've built." Keith's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "The beauty of your plan was its simplicity. Unfortunately, you targeted someone who spent 20 years dealing with men who think violence solves problems." Through the study windows, they could see Marcella and Evan sitting by the lake, unaware that Roman's fate was being decided 50 yards away. "I never wanted to hurt you," Roman said desperately. "It was Marcella's idea. She said you'd never give her a divorce, that you'd fight her for every asset. She convinced me that this was the only way." Keith nodded thoughtfully. "Marcella always was persuasive, but you're a grown man who made grown-up choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. What do you want? Money? I'll disappear and never contact them again. You'll never see me. What I want," Keith said, picking up the pistol and checking its load, "is for you to walk outside and explain to my wife and son that their plan failed. I want you to tell them exactly what's going to happen next. Roman's face went ashen. And if I refuse? Keith smiled the same cold smile that had terrified Evan in the office. Then I'll drag your body outside and explain it myself. Either way, they're going to understand that their game is over. Roman looked at the gun, at Keith's implacable expression, and at the study door that led back to the lake where Marcella waited. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be completely outmatched. All right, he whispered. I'll tell them. Chapter 5. The Reckoning Begins. The walk from Keith's study to the lake took less than a minute, but for Roman it felt like a death march. Keith followed 3 steps behind, the pistol concealed but ready, while Marcella and Evan sat on the wooden dock sharing what they believed were triumphant whispers about their imminent success. Marcella, Roman called out, his voice hoarse with fear. We need to talk. She turned with a brilliant smile that faltered when she saw Roman's ashen complexion and Keith's grim expression behind him. Evan looked up from his chair, confusion replacing his usual sullen resentment. Roman, darling, what's wrong? Marcella stood up, her designer dress pristine and her emerald earrings catching the sunset light. You look terrible. Tell her. Keith's voice carried clearly across the evening air. Tell both of them what you discussed at the hotel last night. Roman's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from the lake. Marcella's confusion shifted to alarm as she realized something had gone catastrophically wrong with their carefully laid plans. Keith, what's this about? She demanded, switching to the imperious tone she used when caught in minor lies about shopping expenses or social commitments. Your boyfriend has something to share about your conversation regarding my unfortunate future heart attack, Keith replied calmly. Go ahead, Roman. Explain to my family how you planned to murder me. The words hit Marcella like physical blows. Her face cycled through denial, panic, and finally desperate calculation as she realized the extent of Keith's knowledge. Evan jumped up from his chair, looking between his parents with growing horror. Dad, what are you talking about? Evan's voice cracked with stress. Murder? That's insane. Keith withdrew his phone and played the hotel room recording. Roman and Marcella's voices filled the evening air, discussing murder with the casual tone most people reserve for dinner plans. Their words about staging Keith's death, liquidating his assets, and consoling grieving, Evan created a surreal soundtrack to the peaceful lakeside setting. Marcella's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Keith, please, you don't understand. It was just talk, just fantasy. We never would have actually. Shut up. Keith's command cut through her protests with absolute authority. Roman, continue with your explanation. Roman looked at Marcella's desperate face and realized that any chance of survival lay in complete honesty. We plan to kill you tomorrow night. Make it look like a heart attack. Marcella knew your routines, your medical history. We had contacts who could make it appear natural. Evan staggered backward, as if struck. Mom, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you weren't actually planning to murder Dad. Marcella's desperate gaze shifted between the 3 men, searching for any avenue of escape or manipulation. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders and revealed the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath her social mask. Your father is a dinosaur, Evan. He was holding all of us back with his primitive thinking and iron control. Roman and I could have built something magnificent from his assets, something worthy of the 21st century instead of his caveman mentality. The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Evan looked at his mother with dawning horror, finally understanding that the woman who'd raised him was capable of murdering his father for money and social status. You're insane, Evan whispered. Both of you are completely insane. Keith felt a moment of hope that his son might yet redeem himself, but Marcella's next words destroyed that possibility. Don't be naive, Evan. You've been helping us for months. Your fingerprints are on every document, every transfer, every piece of evidence that Keith has collected. If we go down, you go down with us. The hope in Keith's eyes died as he watched Evan's face. Instead of rejecting his mother's logic, the young man began nodding slowly, his expression hardening with familiar Cooper stubbornness. She's right, Dad. If you turn them in, I'm ruined too. My whole life is destroyed. Your life is already destroyed, Keith replied. The question is whether you have enough dignity left to face the consequences like a man, or if you'll keep following these two parasites into deeper shame. Evan looked at his father, then at Roman and Marcella, and made his choice. I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't go to prison. We'll have to find another solution. Keith nodded slowly, the last vestige of fatherly love finally extinguished. I see. Well, then you've all made your positions clear. Keith, please. Marcella stepped forward, her voice taking on the seductive tone she'd used during their courtship 20 years earlier. We can work this out. Nobody has to get hurt. We can divide the assets fairly, start fresh. You're still young enough to rebuild. You're right, Keith said. Nobody else has to get hurt. The emphasis on else wasn't lost on any of them. Roman reached into his pocket, prompting Keith to reveal the pistol he'd been concealing. Hands where I can see them, Keith commanded. All of you. Roman slowly withdrew his hand, empty except for his car keys. Keith, this has gone far enough. You're not a killer. Let's all calm down and discuss this rationally. You plan to murder me in my sleep, Keith replied conversationally. Rationality ended when you decided my life was worth less than my bank account. Marcella tried once more. The courts will understand. Temporary insanity, crime of passion. You'll get counseling and probation. Your businesses will survive. Keith looked at his wife of 20 years, the mother of his child, the woman he'd given everything to, and felt nothing but contempt. You still think this is about legal consequences. You still don't understand what you've awakened. A truck engine rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Bernard Houston's pickup appeared on the ranch road, followed by Santiago's dark SUV. Keith had called them during Roman's confession in the study. The cavalry arrives, Keith observed. Now we can begin the real conversation about consequences. As the vehicles parked and their occupants emerged, Roman, Marcella, and Evan finally understood that Keith hadn't brought them here for negotiation. He'd brought them here for judgment. Chapter 6. The Chair. Bernard Houston and Santiago Berger approached the lakeside gathering with the purposeful stride of men accustomed to unpleasant work. Behind them came two additional men Keith had never seen before, Santiago's associates, their faces professionally blank and their movements economical. Evening, boss. Bernard nodded to Keith while keeping his eyes on the three conspirators. Everything ready. Keith surveyed his wife, son, and their accomplice with the same calculating gaze he used to assess unstable construction sites. Bring the chair from the truck. Santiago's men retrieved a heavy wooden chair from the vehicle, an antique piece with solid oak construction and brass fittings that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. They carried it to the dock and positioned it facing the lake, its imposing presence creating an atmosphere of impending judgment. Sit down, Roman. Keith's command carried absolute authority. Roman looked at the chair, then at the 5 men surrounding him, and understood that cooperation was his only option for avoiding immediate violence. He settled into the seat, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckle intensity. This chair belonged to my grandfather, Keith explained conversationally. He used it when he needed to have serious conversations with men who'd crossed him. It survived longer than most of the people who sat in it. Marcella's voice came out as a desperate whisper. Keith, please, this is madness. Think about what you're doing. I am thinking, very clearly. Keith positioned himself directly in front of Roman. I'm thinking about how you plan to murder me. I'm thinking about how my wife chose greed over loyalty. I'm thinking about how my son chose theft over honor. Evan stepped forward, his voice shaking. Dad, we can still fix this. Nobody has to get hurt. We'll leave town, disappear, never bother you again. Keith's laugh was harsh and humorless. Fix this? Son, you helped plan my murder. There's no fixing that level of betrayal. Bernard moved to stand behind Roman's chair, his massive hands resting on the wooden back. Santiago positioned himself to Keith's right, while his associates flanked Marcella and Evan. Roman, Keith continued, I want you to explain to everyone here exactly how you plan to kill me. Every detail. Roman's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. Digitalis, injected into your nighttime bourbon, would cause cardiac arrest that looked completely natural for a man your age. And after I was dead, Marcella would inherit everything as your wife. Evan would manage the businesses as your son and heir. I would help them modernize your operations. Keith nodded thoughtfully. A thorough plan, well-researched, almost professional in its scope. He paused, studying Roman's terrified face. Unfortunately, you made one crucial mistake. What mistake? You assumed I was the kind of man who could be murdered quietly. Keith's voice dropped to a growl. You assumed wrong. Without warning, Keith drove his fist into Roman's stomach with the force of a sledgehammer. The younger man doubled over, gasping for air, his body convulsing as he fought to breathe. Dad, stop! Evan lurched forward, but Santiago's associates restrained him with professional efficiency. Keith grabbed Roman by the hair and pulled his head back to face level. That was for plotting my murder. We're just getting started. The next punch caught Roman across the jaw with a wet cracking sound that made Marcella scream and Evan struggle harder against his captors. Blood flowed from Roman's mouth as he slumped in the chair, barely conscious. Keith, please. Marcella's voice cracked with hysteria. I'll do anything you want. I'll sign any papers, give you any assets, submit to any punishment. Just stop this. Keith turned to his wife with eyes that held no trace of the man who'd once promised to love and protect her. You want to make a deal? Fine. Watch me break every bone in your boyfriend's body, and I'll consider letting you keep your life. You can't be serious. The sound of Roman's ribs cracking under the chair interrupted her protest. Keith had driven his knee into the man's chest with the force of a battering ram, and something vital had given way under the impact. Roman's scream echoed across the lake, sending waterfowl erupting from the reeds in panicked flight. He tried to curl up in the chair, but Bernard's hands held him upright with inexorable strength. I heard my ribs crack under the chair, Keith said to himself, as if testing how the word sounded. Yes, that has a nice ring to it. Evan was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he watched his father systematically destroy the man he'd considered a friend and business partner. Dad, this isn't you. You're not a killer. Keith paused in his assault to study his son's face. You're right. I'm not a killer. I'm something much worse. I'm a man who's been betrayed by his own family. He turned back to Roman, who was struggling to breathe through what were clearly several broken ribs. The beauty of your plan was its simplicity. Unfortunately, my response is even simpler. Keith's next blow was carefully calculated, enough force to cause excruciating pain without causing immediate death. Roman's left arm bent at an unnatural angle as the bone snapped under Keith's grip. Keith, stop this. Marcella's voice had risen to a shriek. You've made your point. We understand. We're sorry. Sorry. Keith looked at her with genuine curiosity. You plan to murder me and steal everything I've built, and you think sorry covers that debt? He returned his attention to Roman, who was now semi-conscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. The difference between us, Roman, is that when I hurt someone, they stay hurt. The final blow was delivered with surgical precision, Keith's fist connecting with Roman's temple in exactly the spot that would cause maximum brain trauma without immediate death. Roman's body went limp in the chair, his breathing shallow and labored. Is he dead? Santiago asked with professional interest. Keith checked Roman's pulse. Not yet, but he will be shortly. Internal bleeding, brain trauma, multiple fractures. Even if we called an ambulance right now, he wouldn't survive the trip to the hospital. Marcella stared at her dying lover with horror-stricken eyes. You murdered him. You actually murdered him. No, Keith corrected. I executed him. There's a difference. Chapter 7. The Hospital. Keith's call to 911 came exactly 12 minutes after Roman's last breath. Calculated timing that would allow paramedics to attempt resuscitation while ensuring that the attempt would fail. When the ambulance arrived, Keith played the role of concerned family friend perfectly, explaining that Roman had suffered some kind of sudden medical emergency during their lakeside barbecue. He just collapsed, Keith told the lead paramedic, his voice heavy with false concern. Started convulsing, then stopped breathing. We tried CPR, but... The paramedics worked frantically over Roman's body, but 20 minutes of advanced life support couldn't overcome the systematic internal damage Keith had inflicted. Roman Cook was pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest pending autopsy. At the hospital, Keith sat in the waiting room with Marcella and Evan, maintaining the facade of a grieving family friend while his wife and son struggled with the psychological trauma of watching someone die violently. Other families moved through the sterile corridors dealing with their own medical emergencies, unaware that one of their fellow visitors was a methodical killer. Mr. Cooper, a young doctor, approached their group, her expression professionally sympathetic. "I'm Dr. Alicia Chambers. I'm sorry for your loss." Keith stood and shook her hand with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, Doctor. Roman was like family to us. Is there anything you can tell us about what happened?" Dr. Chambers glanced at her chart. The preliminary examination suggests massive cardiac failure, possibly brought on by an undiagnosed heart condition. We'll know more after the autopsy, but sometimes young people have genetic abnormalities that don't manifest until they're under extreme stress. Stress. Marcella's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Physical or emotional trauma can trigger cardiac events in susceptible individuals. The doctor explained kindly. Had Mr. Cook been experiencing any unusual pressure lately? Work stress, relationship problems, financial difficulties? Keith answered before Marcella could speak. Roman was excited about a new business venture. Maybe too excited. He'd been pushing himself pretty hard the last few weeks. Dr. Chambers nodded. Overwork is more dangerous than people realize, especially for young men who think they're invincible. She handed Keith a business card. The hospital social worker can help coordinate funeral arrangements if the family needs assistance. After the doctor left, Keith sat back down between his wife and son, his presence radiating calm authority while they struggled with shock and guilt. The hospital's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across their faces, making them look older and more haggard than their years. "What happens now?" Evan whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient hospital noise. "Now we go home," Keith replied calmly. "We mourn our friend's sudden passing. We support each other through this difficult time." Marcella looked at her husband with dawning horror. "You're going to pretend nothing happened. You murdered Roman, and you're going to act like he died of natural causes." "Roman did die of natural causes," Keith said quietly. "The natural consequence of planning to murder someone who doesn't forgive betrayal." A nurse approached their group. "Mr. Cooper, the police would like to speak with you about Mr. Cook's death. It's routine for sudden fatalities." Keith followed the nurse to a small consultation room where Detective Louise Holt waited with a notepad and a tired expression. Holt was a 20-year veteran of Austin PD, experienced enough to recognize when something didn't add up, but pragmatic enough to work with the evidence he had. "Mr. Cooper, I understand you were present when Mr. Cook collapsed?" Keith nodded gravely. "Terrible thing. He was so young, so full of life. Can you walk me through what happened? Start from when Mr. Cook arrived at your property." Keith provided a carefully crafted timeline that positioned Roman's death as a sudden medical emergency during a family gathering. He described Roman as excited about business prospects, perhaps drinking more than usual, complaining of chest pains shortly before collapsing. Did Mr. Cook have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm him? Roman was well liked by everyone who knew him. Keith replied with perfect sincerity. "He was dating my wife's sister and working with my son on a startup venture. Very much part of our extended family." Detective Holt made notes while Keith spoke, occasionally asking for clarification on timing or specific details. The interview lasted 30 minutes and concluded with Holt's assessment that Roman's death appeared to be a tragic but natural occurrence. "We'll wait for the autopsy results before closing the file," Holt explained. "But unless something unexpected turns up, this looks like a young man who pushed himself too hard and paid the ultimate price." Keith returned to the waiting room, where Marcella and Evan sat in stunned silence. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Roman was dead. Their conspiracy had collapsed, and Keith held complete control over their fates. The detective said they're treating it as a natural death pending autopsy, Keith reported. No criminal investigation planned unless the medical examiner finds something suspicious. "And will they?" Marcella asked quietly. Keith's smile was cold and satisfied. Roman died of cardiac arrest brought on by internal injuries. The question is whether those injuries appear consistent with a sudden medical emergency or prolonged physical assault. What does that mean? It means that Santiago's people know how to hurt someone without leaving obvious evidence of murder. Roman's broken ribs could have resulted from falling during cardiac arrest. His other injuries are consistent with convulsions and impact trauma from hitting the dock. Evan stared at his father with growing comprehension. You planned this. The whole thing. You knew exactly how to kill him without getting caught. I knew exactly how to eliminate a threat to my family without facing legal consequences, Keith corrected. The fact that Roman chose to threaten my life made his death a matter of self-defense. Marcella began crying, not from grief for Roman, but from terror at the realization that the man she'd lived with for 20 years was capable of cold-blooded murder disguised as protective action. What happens to us? She whispered through her tears. Keith stood up and straightened his jacket, once again the successful businessman dealing with an unfortunate family emergency. That depends entirely on how well you've learned tonight's lesson about the consequences of betrayal. Chapter 8. The Courtroom. 3 weeks after Roman's funeral, Keith received the call he'd been expecting. The medical examiner had completed the autopsy and identified several injuries that raised questions about the circumstances of death. While the official cause remained cardiac arrest, Detective Holt wanted to conduct additional interviews with everyone present that evening. Keith hired the best criminal defense attorney in Austin, Samuel Collier's recommendation, and prepared for the legal battle he'd anticipated from the beginning. The lawyer, Salvatore Camacho, had built his reputation defending wealthy clients accused of violent crimes, and he understood immediately that Keith's case would require careful narrative management. The physical evidence is problematic, Camacho explained during their first meeting. Multiple broken ribs, fractured arm, significant internal bleeding. While these injuries could theoretically result from a cardiac episode, they're more consistent with assault. Keith listened calmly to the legal assessment. What's our best defense strategy? Self-defense, if necessary. Roman Cook was having an affair with your wife and conspiring to defraud your business. If the prosecution can prove you killed him, we argue that you discovered their plot and acted to protect yourself. And my wife and son's testimony? Camacho's expression grew grim. That's our biggest vulnerability. If they testify against you, especially about premeditation, we're facing murder charges. Keith smiled with the confidence of a man who'd planned for every contingency. Let me worry about my family's testimony. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in downtown Austin. Keith arrived wearing his best suit, looking every inch the successful businessman who'd been tragically caught up in circumstances beyond his control. Marcella and Evan sat in the gallery behind him, their faces pale and drawn from weeks of psychological pressure. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the medical evidence and witness testimony from the evening of Roman's death. Assistant DA Crystal Frederick was young, ambitious, and convinced that Keith Cooper had committed murder during what she characterized as a domestic dispute that escalated to deadly violence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Frederick began her opening statement. The defendant Keith Cooper discovered that his wife was having an affair with Roman Cook. Instead of pursuing legal remedies like divorce or civil litigation, Mr. Cooper chose to handle the situation with his fists. What began as confrontation ended in the brutal murder of a young man whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong woman. Camacho's opening focused on Keith's character, 20 years of business success, community involvement, and family dedication. He portrayed Roman as a predatory young man who'd seduced Keith's wife and manipulated his son as part of an elaborate financial fraud. Keith Cooper isn't a killer, Camacho told the jury. He's a father and husband who discovered that his trust had been betrayed by the people closest to him. When confronted with evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, Roman Cook became violent and threatened Keith's life. What happened next was a father protecting himself and his family from a dangerous criminal. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Alicia Chambers, who testified about Roman's injuries and the medical improbability of such extensive trauma resulting from cardiac arrest alone. Her testimony was damaging but circumstantial. She could establish that Roman's injuries suggested assault, but couldn't prove who had inflicted them. Detective Holt followed with testimony about the crime scene investigation and his interviews with the Cooper family. His notes documented inconsistencies in their stories and his growing suspicion that Roman's death wasn't natural. But the prosecution's case began to unravel when they called Marcella Cooper to testify. "Mrs. Cooper," Frederick began, "please describe your relationship with Roman Cook." Marcella looked at Keith, then at the jury, her hands trembling as she gripped the witness stand rail. He was my son's business partner." "Only a business partner?" A long pause. Keith's eyes never left his wife's face as she struggled with a decision that would determine both their fates. "Roman was also. We had become close friends." Frederick pressed harder. "Mrs. Cooper, were you having an extramarital affair with Roman Cook?" Another pause, longer this time. Marcella's gaze found Keith's, and she saw something in his expression that made her choice clear. "No," she said firmly. "Roman and I were friends, nothing more. He was helping Evan with his business, and he spent time at our house because of that relationship." Frederick looked stunned. "Mrs. Cooper, are you certain?" "Because we have evidence suggesting." "Objection," Camacho interrupted. "The witness has answered the question." The judge sustained the objection, and Frederick moved on to the events of the evening Roman died. But Marcella's testimony continued to support Keith's version. Roman had suffered what appeared to be a sudden medical emergency. Keith had tried to help him, and the gathering had been a routine family barbecue with no hint of violence or confrontation. Evan's testimony proved equally supportive. He described Roman as a friend and business partner who'd shown no signs of conflict with Keith. He portrayed the evening as a pleasant family gathering that turned tragic when Roman suddenly collapsed. "Did you observe any violence between your father and Mr. Cook?" Frederick asked. "No," Evan replied without hesitation. "Dad tried to help Roman when he started having trouble breathing. We all did." "No arguing? No physical confrontation? Nothing like that. It was just a normal evening until Roman got sick." Frederick's case collapsed over the next 2 days as witness after witness, all of whom Keith had either influenced or intimidated, testified to his good character and Roman's sudden medical emergency. The prosecution couldn't produce a single witness willing to describe Keith as violent or Roman's death as anything other than a tragic natural occurrence. When Camacho presented Keith's defense, he focused on character witnesses from the construction industry who described Keith as a fair but firm businessman who'd never been known for violence. He produced business records showing that Keith's companies were financially healthy, undermining any motive for killing Roman to prevent fraud. Most importantly, Camacho presented Keith himself as a witness. "Mr. Cooper," his lawyer began, "did you kill Roman Cook?" Keith looked directly at the jury, his expression radiating sincere grief and confusion. "Absolutely not. Roman was like a son to me. His death was a tragedy that's devastated our entire family." "Did you ever suspect that Mr. Cook was involved in fraudulent activity regarding your business?" "Never. Roman was bright, ambitious, full of good ideas. I was proud to support his business ventures with Evan." "And your relationship with your wife? Were you aware of any inappropriate relationship between her and Mr. Cook?" Keith's performance was masterful, a man struggling with painful questions while maintaining his dignity and love for his family. Marcella and Roman were friends. She enjoyed having young people around the house. There was nothing inappropriate about their relationship. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a not guilty verdict. As Keith walked out of the courthouse a free man, he paused on the steps to address the gathered media. Marcella and Evan flanked him, playing their roles as the grieving family that had been put through additional trauma by an overzealous prosecution. "We're grateful that the jury saw through the prosecution's attempts to criminalize tragedy," Keith said, his arm around Marcella's shoulders. "Roman Cook was a fine young man who died too young. Our family will continue to mourn his loss while rebuilding our lives." That evening, Keith sat in his study with a glass of bourbon, reviewing the legal documents that would formalize his family's new understanding. Marcella and Evan had signed comprehensive confessions detailing their conspiracy with Roman, along with agreements transferring all their assets to Keith's control. They would remain in Austin, living in the ranch house under Keith's supervision, their every movement monitored by Santiago's security team. They would maintain the facade of a loving family, while serving as living reminders of the consequences of betrayal. Keith had won completely, legally, financially, and psychologically. His enemies were dead or broken, his assets were secure, and his reputation remained intact. The price had been his family's souls, but Keith Cooper had never been a man who regretted necessary sacrifices. Chapter 9. The X-Rays. 6 months after the trial, Keith's dominance over his family had crystallized into a routine of psychological control that made their ranch house feel more like a minimum security prison. Marcella moved through her days like a ghost, maintaining appearances for neighbors and business associates while living under constant surveillance. Evan worked at Cooper Construction under Bernard's direct supervision, his every decision subject to Keith's approval, his future permanently tethered to his father's mercy. The final act of Keith's revenge began with a phone call from Dr. Chambers at Austin General Hospital. "Mr. Cooper, we've had an unusual development regarding Roman Cook's case. During a routine review of old files, we discovered some X-rays that were taken but never properly filed with his autopsy report." Keith felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. "What do the X-rays show, doctor?" "Multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, inflicted at least an hour before death. The bone displacement pattern suggests systematic assault rather than accidental injury during cardiac arrest." "That sounds serious." "It is serious, Mr. Cooper. These X-rays would have changed the medical examiner's initial findings significantly. They clearly indicate that Roman Cook was murdered." Keith arranged to collect the X-rays personally, ostensibly to deliver them to the police as a concerned citizen who wanted justice for his friend. But his real purpose was to possess the physical evidence that could destroy him, and use it to complete his psychological domination of his family. That evening, Keith called a family meeting in his study. Marcella and Evan took their usual seats across from his desk, their faces showing the resigned wariness of people who'd learned to fear these gatherings. "I have something to show you," Keith said, spreading the X-rays across his desk under the bright lamp. "Roman's final gift to our family." The images were stark and undeniable. Dozens of fractures in Roman's ribs, arms, and spine, each break clearly showing the force and direction of impact. Even to untrained eyes, the pattern told an obvious story of prolonged, systematic violence. Marcella stared at the X-rays with horror. "Keith, what are these?" "Evidence of murder. Proof that Roman Cook was beaten to death by someone who knew exactly how to inflict maximum damage." Keith's voice remained conversational, almost educational. "The hospital found them during a file review. They're about to be turned over to the police." Evan's face went white. "Dad, if these get out, I'll be arrested for murder, tried again, and almost certainly convicted." Keith nodded calmly. "These X-rays would have prevented my acquittal if they'd been available during the trial." Marcella's voice came out as a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Keith picked up one of the X-ray films and held it to the light, studying the fracture patterns with professional interest. "That depends entirely on my family's continued cooperation. You want us to help you destroy evidence. I want you to understand that your fates are permanently linked to mine." Keith set down the X-ray and fixed them both with his implacable stare. "If these X-rays surface, I'm convicted of murder. But before I go to prison, I'll ensure that both of you are charged as accessories and co-conspirators." "That's impossible," Evan protested. "We testified in your defense." "You committed perjury in my defense," Keith corrected. "You lied under oath to help a murderer escape justice. When I'm convicted, both of your testimonies become evidence of criminal conspiracy. You'll face charges for obstruction, perjury, and accessory after the fact." The legal implications settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Keith had structured their complicity so thoroughly that they couldn't expose him without destroying themselves. "But there's another option," Keith continued, opening his desk drawer to reveal the signed confessions from months earlier. "These documents detail your conspiracy with Roman. including your knowledge of his plan to murder me. If the X-rays surface, I'll claim self-defense again, but this time I'll have written proof that Roman was planning to kill me. Marcella realized the trap's full dimensions. You'll use our confessions to justify murdering Roman. I'll use your confessions to prove that I killed Roman to prevent my own murder. Perfect self-defense, supported by written documentation of the threat to my life. Keith's smile was coldly triumphant. The same evidence that proves your guilt becomes proof of my innocence. Evan looked at the X-rays, then at his father, finally understanding the scope of Keith's planning. You wanted the X-rays to surface. You've been waiting for this moment. I prepared for this moment, Keith corrected. The difference between successful men and failures is that successful men plan for every contingency. Keith walked to his safe and withdrew a manila envelope containing copies of all the X-rays. Tomorrow morning, I'm delivering these to Detective Holt with a cover letter explaining that I recently remembered some details about Roman's behavior that evening. His agitation, his threats, his attempt to attack me when I confronted him about the fraud. You're going to frame this as self-defense? I'm going to present the truth in proper context. Roman Cook planned to murder me, as documented in your signed confessions. When I confronted him with evidence of his crimes, he became violent and threatened my life. I defended myself with appropriate force. Unfortunately, Roman's injuries proved fatal. Keith returned to his desk and began placing the X-rays back in their envelope. The beauty of this situation is that justice will finally be served. Roman's murder will be solved, but the killer will be legally justified in his actions. Marcella struggled to find words for the magnitude of Keith's manipulation. You're going to get away with murder by using our own crimes against us. I'm going to get away with justified homicide by presenting the complete facts of Roman's conspiracy. Keith sealed the envelope with deliberate care. Facts that you helpfully documented in writing. And if we refuse to support your story? Keith's expression hardened into something genuinely terrifying. Then I'll tell Detective Holt that you've been threatening to falsify evidence against me, that you're attempting to frame me for murder to cover up your own crimes. Your signed confessions will support that narrative perfectly. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Keith's antique clock. Marcella and Evan sat trapped between impossible choices, finally understanding that Keith had anticipated and prepared for every possible response to his actions. What do you want from us? Evan asked quietly. I want you to continue being my loving family, Keith replied. Support my story, maintain our public image, and live with the knowledge that Roman Cook died because he chose to threaten the wrong man's life. Keith stood and walked to the window overlooking the lake where Roman had died. Tomorrow, Detective Holt will reopen the investigation. The X-rays will be entered into evidence. I'll provide my revised statement about Roman's threats and his violent attack when confronted with his crimes. He turned back to face his wife and son, his silhouette backlit by moonlight reflecting off the water. And when the investigation concludes that Roman Cook's death was justified homicide committed in self-defense, our family will finally be able to move on from this tragedy. Together, Marcella began crying, not from grief or fear, but from the crushing realization that Keith had engineered a perfect psychological prison from which there was no escape. Every choice led back to him. Every secret he held made them more dependent on his protection. I heard my ribs crack under the chair, Keith said softly, rehearsing the words he would speak to Detective Holt. The ER called my wife and son. They said he had it coming. Even after, he may not survive. They never showed in court. The X-rays made their hands shake. Then I walked into court with the X-rays. The narrative was perfect. Keith as the victim of a murder plot, defending himself against a violent conspirator, supported by his family despite their initial shock at Roman's crimes. The X-rays that should have convicted him would instead vindicate him completely. Keith Cooper had transformed evidence of his guilt into proof of his innocence, turned his victims into accomplices, and emerged from scandal stronger than before. As he prepared for bed that night, Keith reflected on the completeness of his victory. Roman was dead. Marcella and Evan were broken and controlled. His business empire remained intact. His reputation had survived investigation and trial. Most importantly, he had demonstrated to anyone considering betrayal that Keith Cooper never forgave and never forgot. The consequences of crossing him weren't just severe, they were inescapable. In the end, justice had indeed been served. Keith Cooper's justice, measured in broken bones, shattered lives, and the absolute certainty that some men were simply too dangerous to betray. The X-rays would tell their story tomorrow, and Keith would finally close the books on the last loose ends of Roman Cook's conspiracy. After that, he could focus on building his empire even higher, secure in the knowledge that his family understood exactly what happened to people who threatened what he'd built. Keith Cooper had won completely, and he intended to savor that victory for the rest of his life. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.